Servant David. And if you're looking for health awareness, elevation, games, stories, songs, comedy, and more, then come check me out. Servant David Show. Party man and woman, them know. Content for your channel start grow. Stop right just for the party info. Your any name in the intro. Give the Servant David Show. So comment, like, subscribe, and hit that bell. And don't forget to share me out. Yeah? Servant David say love, manners, and elevation.
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for gathering us all today in this important endeavor. We ask that you bestow your guidance and blessing upon each attendee. May we honor one another by keeping an open mind. May we voice our truth and listen with an open heart. Bless everyone present today, that each may be able to share his or her contributions and gifts. Grant good health and safety to loved ones left outside this room, and bestow peace and goodwill to all of us. We ask for your wisdom and grace to use our talents for the betterment of others. May the various activities related to this day be a success through your intervention. With gratitude, we offer this prayer in your name. Amen.
Let's greetings each and every one of you. Well, this is Servant David. And if you're looking for health awareness, elevation, games, stories, songs, comedy, and more, then come check me out. Servant David Show. Holly man and woman, them know. Content for your channel start grow. Stop right just so the all the info. You hear the name in the intro. It's the Servant David Show. So comment, like, subscribe, and hit that bell. And don't forget to share me out. Yeah? Servant David said love, manners, and elevation.
Well, manners, love, and elevation to each and every one of you. I want to take the time out right now to thank each and every one of you for being here. Those of you who are just now coming in, thank you so much for being here. Those of you in the mystery room, thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to have your presence. And can I let you know that it is not in vain? To those of you who happen to be here for the first time, I welcome you with love, manners, and elevation. Welcome to the Servant David Show. I, of course, am your host, Servant David. To those of you who come in and catch the replay, starting from here, till the end. May your store basket never run empty. Thank you. To those of you who are in the chat, I want to say a big manners love and elevation to you. People like Patrick Watson, how you doing this evening, my brother? Good to see you, good to have you. Please do not text me while I'm on the air. Our vlogs, I see you in the chat. Manners love and elevation to you. I see some starting to come in, roll in, and starting to come in. So I want to thank you all. And I see Patrick Watson is saying, "What's up, Servant David?" Well, no, there's a lot that's up. You know, there's a lot of things that has been hidden from us. There's a lot of things that have been put in our plain sight, and yet we still can't see it. There are a lot of information that is not given or not known. And I, the old troublemaker, I'm gonna give you some of those informational truths. To all man, I wanna say thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to have your presence. You know, a lot of times, a lot of situations, they arise, and it's concerning financial statuses and things like that. And people are always saying, "Oh, well, we are a third world country and we are this and we're less fortunate and that and this." And sometimes we take terms and words and phrases and say them, even songs we sing, and we don't know what the rats we're singing. Let me go down into the opening song.
Now onto the baby.
Go into this opening song.
This one reaching out.
Let me go into this opening song.
This is Rodney Price, aka.
Do you know about the first world? Do you know about the third world countries?
This one reaching out.
Have you heard about those countries?
This one.
Have you heard about even a second world country?
This one reaching out to all the
Or maybe you've heard of or never have heard of fourth world countries.
This one reaching out to all the
I believe America itself is heading for towards the third world country status. But this morning I briefly did something on it, and this evening I'm gonna round it up and give you more details on this first world, second world, third world, and fourth world countries. As we go into the opening song.
None of my say, I'm stop man, me I cut them studio. This one reaching out to all the leaders and the media. This is Rodney Price, aka.
I hope that you guys can learn something from this.
Well, poor people fed up.
I hope that you guys get something from this.
We pick the balls. Poor people fed up. Joy system shake up well every day they get to use that now. He asked the leader, him and the audience, he make poor people surrounded by danger.
What information do you know about the first world countries? What do you know or what do you don't know? What about the second world countries? Did you know
and give me quarter.
I mean, have you even noticed
Disconnect me light and chop off me water.
that they go from first world to third world and always leaving out that in between? Yeah, I'm that troublemaker. I'm that troublemaker. I'm home.
Them a go down in a flames of water. Sister, I see I no take it for no laughter. Where people fed up, to all your system shake up.
Well, we're gonna go into it, yeah.
Where people
Nightbot, I want to thank you for being here. Thank you for doing your job.
fed up. Some lost them roots, some forgot them culture. You study the past, them not know the future. So them not take telling, so them end up so vulgar. Them don't know Selassie I from Ethiopia. As me man take me for any joker. That same man make me hold them note. Me no play them casino, me no play them poker. Them plan to destroy me with the coke and drugs. No travel is just like a them barracuda. Plan to lick run it better for the piece of scooter. You think them like to see me in a them hot car, yeah. With them hot girl, yeah.
I sing them song, yeah.
Them song your tongue and on the fire and hold them. You go hang copal with a
Piece of rope, yeah.
just become me fed up. Two of them systems.
Are you fed up the way the world is running? I always thought it was one world, one universe, one world. Whether they get the first, second, third, fourth, them soon come with a fifth.
Back to one can tell ya. Long time be free, him no come near you. Honey, the other one make claims that him a come slow. That 75% of a week quarter. Come and the London one biggie we are here come. Disconnect me light and cut off me water to the King of Kings. Well, me know them shall answer. The Lord of Lords, well I am a sponsor. The lion from Judah, them well one conquer. The eagle and the bear and the queen and her daughter. Yes, I see I mean what the whole of them offer. But them would go down in the flames of water. Till I see I work, it's not fun or laughter. Yes, we say we fed up.
Sure, the system
Shut up the issue country, we big people.
boss.
Get the people fed up. To all your system shut up. Every day we black rather fed up. Some lost them roots and forgot them culture. No study the past, they not know the future. They know Selassie I will come from Ethiopia. See what has me man to take me for any joker. Them not take telling, so them get vulgar. They play them casino and I support them poker. Here Selassie I make me hold them note here. Not revolutious like a them barracuda. Plant to liquor and it gets a fine piece of scooter. Think them like to see we in a them hot girl, yeah. With them hot girl, yeah. I sing them song, yeah. Them song you stronger than your fire and Nubia. Yes, Selassie I am the rightful ruler. I go and go with a piece of rope, yeah. Become me fed up. To all them systems shake up them issues.
What we see is every weakness, every trial, every mountain and sea. Hey, it's your girl, The Flame, and you're in tune to the Servant David Show. Keep it locked right here and don't change the dial.
As the saying goes, there's poor and then there's poor. The United States, for instance, has relative poverty, but those living on very meager earnings or government handouts will most of the time have food to eat and a roof over their head. In 2017, The Guardian reported that around 30% of Britain's children were classified as being poor, and 2/3 of them came from working families. While these children will most of the time still be fortunate enough to receive a full school education, they may also often be eating food that came from food banks. But what is it like to live in abject poverty, with a threadbare safety net hanging below you, if any safety net at all? That's what we'll find out today in this episode of the Infographic Show, Poorest Countries in the World. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell button so that you can be part of our notification squad. First of all, when looking at data, the list of the poorest nations changes from resource to resource, but certain countries stand out. As many of those are in Africa, we will also choose some countries that are perhaps not the poorest in the world, but are the poorest in their part of the world. We'll start with Madagascar, an island nation in the Indian Ocean off the east coast of Africa. While famed for its unique wildlife and natural beauty, it's one of the poorest nations on Earth. It was reported in 2015 by the UN that much of the 25 million population has no secure food supply, and in the same year, photos appeared in the world's media showing emaciated children that reminded people of African famine in the 80s. 9 out of 10 people live on less than $2 a day. It's a precarious environment with droughts, floods, and locust plagues common. Disease is rife, as is malnutrition. The sad thing is, UNICEF says the island is largely ignored in terms of international donors. If we turn to Asia, the poorest nation there is said to be Afghanistan, which is reportedly slightly poorer than Nepal. The World Bank states that poverty is rising in the country, writing that lately 1.3 million more Afghans are unable to satisfy their basic needs. Due to conflicts, there has been less aid given to the country, not to mention the damage done to job growth and infrastructure. Much of the country's population is illiterate and unskilled, and unemployment there just keeps rising. It's thought 1/3 of the country's 34.6 million people are food insecure. It's also said there are about 3 million people in the country addicted to opiates. Afghanistan is generally considered the poorest nation not in Africa, along with some island nations in the Pacific. Another country outside of Africa that is very poor is the Caribbean nation of Haiti, sometimes regarded as the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere. The BBC reports that the nation may have gained its independence from France, but that came at a crippling cost. It's seen ruthless dictators, economic instability, and terrible natural disasters such as the 2010 earthquake that caused significant damage to the country's infrastructure.
Free us,
Almost
how
a
you
third
doing
of the
this
country
evening?
lives in extreme poverty.
How you doing this evening, my friend? Manners, love, and elevation to you. Thank you. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Excuse me. Manners, love, and elevation to you. Thank you for being here, my brother. How you doing this evening? Thank you so much for your time. It is not in vain. Can I encourage you that much? And can I tell you that I reckon that you do know about the title that you saw: first, second, third, and yes, even fourth world countries. If not, this is the place to be if you want to, get to know a little bit about it, because I hear all these people talking about, oh, I'm from a third world country, and so this and so that, and da 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 da, and we're just gonna I'm gonna have some light shed on what third world, fourth world, second world, and even first world countries are. I reckon that America, I said this a little bit earlier, but America itself is heading towards a third world country. We are turning into a third world country. Right now, we kind of still are holding that mantle a little bit, but just by the fingernail, not even the fingers. Listen.
And another third are said to be poor. According to World Bank, this means those in extreme poverty live on less than $1.23 per day, and those that are poor live on less than $2.41 a day.
On this program, this is a program where you can kick off your shoes and let your smelly feet just go. Let them breathe out. You can be yourself here. You can definitely and only get truth here. I always tell people, though, a parental discretion is advised for adults, not even the children. Parental discretion is advised for adults when listening to the Servant David Show. And please, no offense, but enter at your own risk, because thin-skinned people get pinch round your son.
Furthermore, the Borgen Project said in 2017 that half of the 10 million plus people don't have a job, 3/4 of households have no running water, and disease and malnutrition is pervasive. In South America, the poorest nation is thought to be Bolivia. With a population of around 11 million, this landlocked country that borders Brazil, Peru, Paraguay, and Chile has seen its extreme poverty rate drop from 38.2% to 16.8% over the last decade. The worst of the poverty is in the rural parts of the country, but UNICEF reports that as many as 60% of all Bolivians live below the poverty line. The number is higher in rural areas, mainly because of the fact the country lacks connecting infrastructure to urban areas. These people struggle to find clean drinking water and services. According to Habitat for Humanity, 58% of Bolivian families live in slums and have no direct access to basic services or sanitation. The unemployment rate, though, according to the same source, is only 6.2%. Going over to Europe, most sources put Moldova as the poorest country there. The Eastern European nation that borders Romania and Ukraine has a population of around 3.5 million. According to the World Bank, 6% of the country lives on less than $2.50 a day, but the worst hit are those living in rural communities. Many of these people have no access to clean drinking water or sewage systems. The country lacks infrastructure, is plagued by corruption, and job opportunities are few for the rural poor. This is why many have left or are trying to leave the country. According to the Borgen Project, young people are needed for economic growth, but they will not stay in the country if they do not see a future there. When Moldovans were polled in 2017 about what they most worry about, the top answers were high prices, poverty, corruption, and diseases. 73.
Please share this out. Please share this out.
Not give them a decent standard of living. The poll was published by the country's state news agency. Back in Africa, there are two countries that regularly find themselves on the list of poorest in the world. The first one we will talk about is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is sometimes said to have the lowest GDP per capita in the world. Other sources such as CIA Factbook state that it is actually Somalia, and other sources such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund state that it is the Central African Republic. We will first talk about the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This Central African country, called Zaire for many years, has a population of around 79 million. The country is said to be super rich in resources, but 63% of its citizens live below the poverty line of $1.90 or even $1 a day. This is sad because the World Bank says that with such good arable land and deposits of natural gas, iron, gold, diamonds, platinum, and uranium, it could be one of the richest African nations. Despite this, the average person there will make around $800 a year. The country, however, has historically been ravaged and plundered of minerals and its people for slaves by European nations, while the former Soviet Union and the United States also carried out proxy wars there. It's a nation that has known no peace, and in recent times has been ruled by vicious dictators that sometimes had support from the West. The country is still rife with corruption, and this is holding it back. Poverty leads to disease, and this is why people living there can expect to live on average to only 59 years old. Human rights abuses are so many we could write an entire show about those alone. As we just said, also at the bottom of the list of poorest nations is the Central African Republic. Just north of the border to the Democratic Republic of Congo, it too is said to be very rich in minerals and arable land. The population is about 5 million. Many of these people live on around $750 a year. About 67% of the population lives on less than $1 a day. Half of the population is illiterate, with the average person receiving about 3.5 years of schooling in total. This nation too has seen violent conflicts, ongoing corruption, and human rights abuses, while disease and malnutrition is widespread. Life expectancy is said to be around 51 years. With no end in sight to violence and corruption, this mineral-rich nation looks like it will remain poor for some time to come. So, is life in your country different from life in the countries we just discussed? Let us know how in the comments.
Now on to the babe and the suckling, or even the ugly duckling, keep listening. Ranking is talking, get that kind of spin.
Hey.
It's just reality. It's a barranking mind. Reality, some of them have eyes and still looking blind. You hear me? Reality. It's a barranking mind. Reality, blank people must have lived like swine. But what a moody have that has never been told. It has ridiculous.
So what do you guys think about that part, huh?
Man coming
Just getting started.
What about?
What do you think about those poor countries?
It's like
Do you consider the country where you are to be poor?
so big and mighty, strong and bold. It's just reality.
I would say America is poor. We're not as rich as we portray to be. In just my opinion, though.
Reality, some of them
We are the only country, I think, really, who has so much credit.
like say me don't know me.
Credit card this and credit card that.
Me from
You don't have to have the money right away to do things, but go over to Jamaica and try that with someone.
Dr. Martin Luther King and Marcus Garvey.
I don't think they have things like that.
I'm know me roots culture.
I'm not saying they don't have credit cards, but I'm just saying, you think they have credit to get house and credit to get car and all those things like that? They have to work and get it, or rob or do whatever they have to do to get what they have to do and build what they have to build. That's why so many houses in Jamaica are unfinished.
One like the break across the line. We know we
Am I right, I say?
Everlasting love, you seek that and you will find. Stop
America no better.
deaf and blind, it's just reality.
It's just
And some
reality.
are rocking mind. Reality, some of them have eyes and still
reality.
blind. And hear me, reality. And some are rocking mind. Reality,
It's just
some of them
reality.
are still rocking blind. And a rebel, Robert
Mr. Marley.
Roots rock reggae, in praise the reality. What him a preach is the black people to the
Mm.
all them a go and them have got a lock and key. Africa is the land of my
As we go further down into the devotions,
know you about me, it's just reality. And some are rocking mind. Reality, some of them have
first world,
what is
second world,
and me.
third world,
You get me from the
and fourth world countries. What are your views?
I'm a
Feel free to type them in the chat. This is the program where you do not have to wear your church clothes if you don't want to.
He's a man with dig it out in a black history.
So you can loosen up your tie,
Wide and
take off your jacket even,
with the fight, we want some reality.
get into some sweatpants or shorts.
With the black nation, them love to connect. Watch this. Mandela be free and both of it I know.
What we see is every weakness, every trial, every mountain and sea. Hey, it's your girl, The Flame, and you're in tune to the Servant David Show.
This is Brother Wonder representing for Servant David, the man with slew Goliath.
Welcome to the Investors Trading Academy talking glossary of financial terms and events. Our word of the day is third world country. A term often used to define a country with a less developed economy is a third world country. This definition was coined during the Cold War to identify a country's political beliefs when they fell outside of communism or capitalism. The term evolved into a description of a nation lacking self-sufficiency and experiencing high birth rates and poverty. The World Bank uses income per capita to classify countries previously measured by gross national product. A formula based on earnings and financial health ranks each country annually. In some instances, the bank uses geographical information to determine if a country is a developed economy or falls under another designation. Developing nations are commonly referred to as third world. These developing countries can be found in Asia, Africa, Oceania, and Latin America. These countries were at one point colonies, which were formerly led by imperialism. The end of imperialism forced these colonies to survive on their own. A third world country is a country whose views are not aligned with NATO and capitalism and the Soviet Union and communism. The use of the term third world started during the Cold War and was used to identify which of three categories the countries of the world aligned with.
Hold on them. How you think you're hiding from? I say hide from yourself. Hear me now. Check. Just remember this. Remember, say God not slave. All what you are going with that you feel, say nobody not say. Remember, say God not slave. Whenever you feel for rob and rape and kill, and whenever you want shit. Remember, God not slave. When you only on no Sunday, but you dirty for the rest of the week, y'all. Remember, God not slave. Every time you're bound to make a wrong move. Remember this before you do it. Remember he's the Lord of Lords, the King of all kings. Just remember that he knows and he sees all things, all sins, all of the details. The small things is like the super camera running the film of all films, and I'm talking the wicked and the yard place. All of war seeking cover in the dark place. See when you hiding and things so that him can't catch you. If only when you take your last breath, cause God not slave. It's all when you walk around with that you feel, so nobody not say. Just remember, God not slave. Whenever you feel for rob and rape and kill, whenever you want chase. Remember, God not slave. Him see what you do yesterday and all of what you keep up last week. Remember, say God not slave. Every time you out to make a wrong move, think about your beat. Because what? Him never chose yet, him always right away. He never take no vacation. I go on no break. So if you feel so you can trick him, you making a mistake. No fake ticket can't get you through the pearly gate. So make a change before it's too late. talking to the murderers and all who are thief and who are brave, who see the root and try to deviate. Time for you just get back on the narrow and the straight. God not say, all when you are wrong with that, you feel nobody not say. Remember, God not say, whenever you feel for rob and rape and kill, whenever you want chase, just remember, say God not say. Yes, all who are would one like say them a shame. Just remember, say God not say. Hear me now, I don't want to misunderstand you, but you know, because I'm not trying to preach to you. Me just a beg and a beseech to you. What the Father listen me, I teach to you. Heart dirty clean that. Let Jah be the bleach to you. Cause how you treat people, same thing I go reach to you. So it no matter if you ball or dialogue, if you a Catholic, Muslim or even Orthodox, when you carry out the dirty acts, just remember him no need no spectacles and him no wear no contacts. And God not say, so all when you are born with that, you think nobody not say. Remember, so God not say, whenever you feel for rob and rape and kill, whenever
What we see is every weakness, every trial, every mountain and sea. Hey, it's your girl, The Flame, and you're in tune to the Servant David Show. Keep it locked right here and don't change the dial.
Is the Philippines a third world country? That's the question that we're going to be addressing in this video. And the short answer is no, it is not a third world country. I'm going to talk very briefly about why I'm making this video, why it's come up. Second, I'm going to talk about what the third world system is and answering the question why the Philippines is not a third world country. So stay tuned and you'll get the answer in this video. The reason I'm making this video is I keep getting over and over in the comment sections in my videos about the Philippines being a third world country, usually in a very derogatory sense that people don't want to come here because, oh, it's a third world country, I'd prefer to stay in mine. And they really show their ignorance when they're saying this. So that's why I'm making this video, so I can forever dispel the myth of the Philippines being a third world country. The world's first, second, and third worlds was originally a political division that was made up by a French economist back in the early 1950s. Now, this was in response to the Cold War, to where you basically had the United States and NATO on one side after World War II, and the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, as well as their respective allies, on another. And then in the middle were all of the countries that were non-military aligned with those two great blocs during the Cold War. The First World was defined by the United States, NATO, and anyone who was in a military alliance with those two entities. The United States obviously being a member of NATO. So that included lots of different countries that sometimes are thought of, for whatever reason, as the third world today. So one of those countries was indeed the Philippines. Another was Thailand. Another was Japan, and many others, as you can see from the maps that I'm listing here. So anyone who was in a military alliance with the United States or with NATO was considered a first world country. It didn't have anything to do with economics. It didn't have anything to do with poverty. It didn't have to do with how much industrial development a country it had. It simply was a political division of, were you in a military alliance with either the United States or with NATO as a whole? The Second World was the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, and anyone who was in a military alliance or who was aligned with those countries. So obviously you had the Soviet Union, you also had East Germany, much of Central Europe, and some other countries such as China and Vietnam, really a in the 1950s and the 1960s, it was a division of communism and their allies, even though later on some of those countries, such as China and Vietnam, or China and Russia, stopped being very friendly with each other. It was still all considered the Second World. Folks,
Tuba Chat, thank you for being here.
you hit subscribe so that you can find me again in the future, and also hit the like button if you want to tell others that this is a video that's worth watching. Really helps in the YouTube algorithm to get it out there and let folks know that this
Thank you so much for that share, Tuba. Thank you so much. Your time is not in vain, and it's greatly appreciated. Thank you, sir.
The Third World was any country that was left over that was not in an alliance with the United States or NATO, or with the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. And so, although most of the countries were in Southeast Asia, in Africa, predominantly in Africa, and in Latin America, it didn't necessarily have anything to do with economic status. In fact, it didn't have anything. It was just, were you in an alliance with one of these people or not? So you've got some anomalies in there. For instance, with Ireland. Ireland was a very developed country. It has a good standard of living. It's usually most people would think of as a first world country who are ignorant of the reason that we have these three divisions. In point of fact, under that definition, Ireland, Finland, and other countries that were not aligned would have been the third world, because they were not politically aligned between one of these two great blocs during the Cold War. Now, we'll move into how the perception of this changed at the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. After the Cold War, when the Soviet Union had finally collapsed, the Berlin Wall had come down, communism was basically extinct in all but maybe 6 countries throughout the world. The first, second, and third world really didn't have the meaning that it once had. It was no longer useful as a political tool to determine what side of the blocks you were on, because really only one of those blocks survived. And then everybody else who was not in a military alliance with the first world. And it became to mean, because many of those countries had been in Africa, had been in Latin America, and were considered developing countries, many of those countries actually weren't poor. We had mentioned about Ireland and Finland and some of the others, Yugoslavia, which broke off, Brazil. These places were not necessarily what you would think of as third world or poor countries or developing countries. They were countries that had large economies and were fairly strong. But because many of those countries had been in Africa, had been in Latin America, had been underdeveloped, then a lot of people got it in their minds who weren't educated that these countries were third world. And third world translated to not industrialized, translated in their minds to being poor. Had nothing to do with that. That's just the way that certain people associated with that, with the third, second, and first world, because they didn't understand and weren't educated in how it was really the meaning was supposed to be derived from. So as these meanings became twisted, we start seeing people who are not educated in these facts and who are ignorant as to what the meanings are, start using them in a derogatory manner. And that's what we started seeing in the comments in the videos here about the Philippines. And I had in real life friends, family members who would describe certain countries that I was going to as third world countries. And it made me chuckle inside every time, and later makes me want to beat my head against the wall, because it is so ignorant as to what the term actually means. And it doesn't mean poor. It doesn't mean that. It means exactly what we had explained here.
Hey, Momo, thanks for being here.
So when I see that in the comment section of somebody doing that, trying to make a point, and they feel that they've really done something and they're really smart and they've made that point, all they've done in my mind is shown how ignorant they are and that they really don't know what they're talking about. And anyone in here who's going to say, no, the meaning of the word has changed, it's evolved, we have a vernacular in English, Yeah, we do have vernacular in English, but the meaning hasn't changed. And if you go to the dictionary to where people are trying to show where first world has had some updates to it, all you have to do to know that the term really hasn't changed officially in any capacity, especially in academics, is go to the definition for second world. And lo and behold, the definition for second world is unchanged since the 1950s. It stayed exactly the same because they don't know how to categorize that. So it's still a political term. It's being used by people that don't know what they're talking about to describe it as third world, but it's really inaccurate. So one way to describe some of these countries and to be accurate and non-derogatory would be to describe them as developing countries or countries that are not yet industrialized or have a beginning of industrialization in their countries, or that just have a lot of poverty compared to nations that have a very robust economy, very highly industrialized, or even post-industrialization to where they've become and morphed into a service economy and making even more money. And you even see ignorance about this in academia. So when I occasionally will see, usually from some silly major that's trying to make some sort of a point, that they'll start throwing around the term third world. And I saw an entire presentation, and it had a good heart. It was dealing with women around the world and discrimination against women and feminism and everything else. And they showed this map. And this map has to be the most racist, ignorant thing that I have ever seen in my entire life. It basically has in green all of the third world countries, and then in yellow, countries that are usually considered third world. And if you will notice, other than Europe, Canada and the United States, Australia and New Zealand, in other words, every place else in the world that doesn't have predominantly white people must be the third world. Now, I'm sure that the author of this presentation wasn't thinking about that when they did it, but boy, does this make them look really dumb. And the subliminal message that's coming out of it and the just outright racism wants me to bang my head against a wall, because this stuff shouldn't be put out there in academics. God help what we're teaching our children in colleges nowadays. Back to the Philippines. The Philippines is a first world country. It always has been, because it has, since basically it was a country in 1946 when it got its independence from the United States, it has been consistently in a military alliance and under the protection in many cases of the United States. And that, by definition, from our French economists back in 1952, is what a first world country is. It has nothing to do with the economy of the Philippines. Now, the Philippines is a developing country, and you can see by some of the stuff that I have put up when I went to BGC and some of these other places that in many parts, the economy, the Philippines is changing. It's becoming much more modern in certain areas. There's infrastructure developments that are going on right now here in Mindanao, where I'm currently at. We have a massive project where they're going to be building a train that is going to transit from Tagum all the way down to General Santos, which is really going to improve the infrastructure here in Mindanao, which has really been a place that's really been neglected in many cases in the Philippines compared to other places. So the Philippines is not a third world country. It's a first world country. It is a developing country, and it's got a lot of promise for the future. So now that you know what the truth is, the next time that you see somebody saying that in a comment section or in real life, you can, in a very nice way, educate them as to the fact that they don't know what they're talking about.
You see, right now, I just got me a deal there. So what I want, my friend Josh Dix?
Why, Richie Stevens, with us today, I give the Almighty praise.
And the best thing that, cause when I remember just where
I am coming from, to where I'm standing now, fell to my knees in praise of your name. Thanking you, Lord, every step of the way. Oh, Father, you know I love you. You touch my heart, my soul with your mercy. I thank you, my Lord, for all you've done for me. You bless my life in so many ways. Oh, I will never ever leave you. I won't be ungrateful to you, my Lord. I know that this world is all in your hands. We are your children, and so we give you praise. Oh, Father, you know I love you. You touch my heart, my soul with your mercy. I thank you, my Lord, for all you've done for me. You bless my life in so many ways. Father, I know in so many ways. Oh, Lord. So when I remember just where I'm coming from, to where I'm standing now, fell to my knees in praise of your name. Thanking you, Lord, every step of the way. Oh, Father, you know I love you. You touch my heart, my soul with your mercy. I thank you, my Lord, for all you've done for me. You bless my life in so many ways. Oh, I will never ever leave you out. I won't be ungrateful to you, my Lord. I know that this world is all in your hands. We are your children, and so we give you praise.
Study, you may have noticed that it goes from 1 to 3, and there's one number missing. First world countries and third world countries. For those of you who have moderate to extremely good counting skills, and maybe even those of you who are below average in the area of study, you may have noticed that it goes from 1 to 3, and there's one number missing. Anyways, are there second world countries? And more importantly, why are digits assigned to different areas of the world? A long time ago, if you count the 1950s a long time ago, in a France far, far away, depending on the scale you're using and the assumption that you're not watching this video from France. So, what was one of the most notable scenarios of the latter half of the 20th century? Nothing other than the Cold War, of course. Back to the French. A French demographer and anthropologist, Alfred Sauvy, coined the term Third World. He based it on the third estate of pre-revolutionary France, who were the commoners and were not involved with the nobility or clergy, and generally had no say in what went on with anything important in the country. The same could be said for third world countries. They were not involved in the massive war of ideologies concerning the superpowers who pretty much ran the show. As you can guess, first and second world countries were made from Sauvy's coinage of the term Third World, referencing the clergy and the nobility, the first and second estates of pre-revolutionary France, although which one is which hardly matters. As you pass that counting exam from earlier, well, hopefully, you might be able to deduce that the first world is referencing the capitalist superpowers, while the second world refers to the communist nations opposing the West. So, in the simplest terms possible, first world equals US, UK, Canada and their allies, aka the Western Bloc. Second world equals the communist nations such as China, the Soviet Union and their allies, aka the Eastern Bloc. Third world equals nations not aligned with either. Simple, right? Not really. What's the point of me making a video if there isn't going to be some confusion? Usually, things tend to change once a team loses its star player. Not this type of star, but that type of star. Once the Soviet Union was taken off life support, the Second World lost its power, and has never come close to reacquiring it. Once the Cold War was over, the term Second World became useless, and the system of terms changed. The First World still came to mean the capitalist powers of the world, while the Third World came to mean underdeveloped and impoverished nations. However, these new definitions are considered to be outdated, and their only real use is in popular culture and everyday usage. So technically, if you went by the original definitions, which are by far the most sensical of the two, Sweden, Finland, and Switzerland, among other countries, would be Third World countries, as they remain neutral in the Cold War. On the other hand, countries like Namibia and Angola were considered First World countries, although they are far from economic powers. So we have three worlds, except there's a fourth. The fourth world was coined separately from the other three worlds. The fourth world means nomadic hunters, gatherers, subpopulations, native groups, or groups living in third world conditions in a first world country. Although the term is not fully accepted. All of these worlds that we've been talking about are under the three-world model. The confusion only gets more confusing when you introduce the three-world theory. The three-world theory was introduced by Mao Zedong, the Chinese revolutionary. It describes the first world as superpowers, the second world as lesser powers, and the third world as exploited nations. If you're thinking what I think you're thinking, then you think that this better describes the three-world model we have today. And although that's kind of right, the two systems have nothing to do with each other. So to summarize, the second world is no longer used because the USSR isn't around anymore, and the system has been altered to stereotype rich and poor countries, which kind of describes the three-world theory, which is, ironically, a theory of the second world of the three-world model. Thanks for watching.
Psalms 127, Selah. Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Except the Lord keep the city, the watchman watch it. But in thank you, it's just another day. Selah. It's just another day. Oh, thank you, Jamie, wake up this morning. Roll out the earth before me start yawning. Turn round, bust a kiss for me, darling. Tell her, say, honey, me a touching at the street. In the street, me see poor people bawling. No juvenile deed on yam from money. Where the black woman future me oxen. Where the system a do fishy. No, big up the girl, them we fight it alone. And a race 2, 3, picnic on them one. Where the man, they no man, no they won't. Babylon have them in a jail. Big up the juvenile, them in a the street. Where you say them have to make it and not touch the chrome. Them no one with the claim our own. But Africa now found no hole in a rope. Get the youth, we go on and on. Babylon, where we go. Hungry from morning till night come. Them want we believe our life so. Them I wonder if the youth, them a go stop. No. I wonder if the ghetto a go drop. No. Them I wonder if the catching of the trap. No. I wonder if Jah turn him back. No. Thank you, Jamie, wake up this morning. Turn up and smile out when we see it storming. Me vision say better days coming. Every day that me a free. Me no see no job, no free education, but them did promise. None of them never give with nothing. It's like ghetto youth lost to the system. Every day that me a free. No, big up the girl, them we fight it alone. And a race 2, 3, picnic on them one. Where the man, they no man, no they won't. Babylon have them in a jail. Big up the juvenile, them in a the street. Where you say them have to make it and not touch the chrome. Them no one with the claim our own. But Africa now found no hole in a road. Get the youth, we go on and on. Babylon, where we go. Hungry from morning till night come. Them want we believe our life so. Them I wonder if the youth, them a go stop. No. I wonder if the ghetto a go drop. No. Them I wonder if the catching of the trap. No. I wonder if Jah turn him back. No. Thank you, Jamie, wake up this morning. Roll out the earth before me start yawning. Turn round, bust a kiss for me, darling. Tell her, say, honey, me a touching at the street. In the street, me see poor people bawling. No juvenile deeds on yam from money. Where the black woman future me oxen. Where the system a do fishy. No, big up the girl, them we fight it alone. And a race 2, 3, picnic on them one. Where the man, they no man, no they won't. Babylon have them in a jail.
Have you ever wondered
This is Brother Wonder representing for Servant David, the man with slew Goliath.
Have you ever wondered what makes a country developed or developing? We typically divide countries into two categories that are developed countries and developing countries. In these categories, developed countries are often referred to as first world countries, as they are self-sufficient nations. The economy of developed countries is highly progressed and possess great technological infrastructure as compared to other nations. According to the United Nations Report 2020, 35 nations are termed as developed. Australia, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, United States are among some of the developed countries. Developing countries, on the other hand, are countries that are still in the early stages of economic development, with low industrialization. They depend on developed countries for their establishment. These are classified as third world countries or lower developed countries. According to the United Nations in 2020, 126 countries were considered developing. Colombia, India, Kenya, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Thailand, and Nigeria are among some of the developing countries. However, it is challenging to figure out how to determine the differences between developed and developing countries. For example, United Nations divides countries into either as established or developed economies, transitional economies, and developing economies, as they represent the core economic characteristics of the country. On the other hand, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, considers several factors while determining the status of a country. Similarly, the World Bank divides countries into four categories: high-income economies, upper-middle-income economies, lower-middle-income economies, and low-income economies. Hence, even the experts cannot agree on a standard definition, as there are several factors involved. Now the question arises, what are the main factors that determine if a country is developed or developing? We will tell you about it in this video, along with some examples of different countries. Economists generally agree that both economic as well as non-economic factors, including human resources, natural resources, political freedom, and technology, are the main indicators that influence the economy as well as the development of the country. Governments in highly developed countries place a strong emphasis on these issues. On the basis of these indicators, gross domestic product, GDP, or gross national income, GNI, per capita, the level of industrialization, the overall standard of life, and the amount of technological infrastructure, i.e. Human Development Index, HDI, all are included in the factors that can be used to classify a country as a developed or developing nation. Now, you might have a few questions popping your mind, like what is GDP per capita? Or what does HDI mean? Let us explain it to you. Gross domestic product, or GDP, is a total market value of all finished goods and services produced within a country in a specific time. It includes all public and private consumption, investments, as well as foreign balance of trade. GDP per capita is the tally of all the goods and services in a country in 1 year by a person, as expressed in US dollars. The countries with highest per capita are the countries with unusual concentration of wealth. Although GDP is useful for acquiring insight into the world's economic powerhouses and dividing nations based on their economic status,
Taylor family, thank you for being here so much. Your time is not in vain. Thank you so much, Taylor
For
family.
that matter, Human Development Index, HDI, is a measuring tool used by United Nations to assess the social and
Jim Bob, how you doing, my brother?
of a
God,
country
good to
based on
see you.
life
Good to see you. God bless you, my brother. Thank you
educational
for your
attainment,
time, bro.
and gross national income, GNI. HDI places a higher emphasis on human development than
And
the
you guys just give me a small moment. I soon turn on the camera. Just give me a moment, yeah?
capacity. This index is useful for examining the impact of policy choices made by each nation as well. It ranks the countries based on their development. There is no minimum requirement of HDI for a developed status. However, most of the developed countries have HDIs of 0.8 or higher. So let's differentiate developed and developing countries in the light of these factors now. Developed countries typically share the following characteristics. Number 1, they have a high HDI, high per capita income and GDP as compared to developing countries. Number 2, the birth rate and death rates are stable. They do not have exceptionally high birth rates, and infant mortality is low because of the quality medical care and high living standards. Number 3, they have better infrastructure, and the level of security is high because of advanced technology. Number 4, the unemployment rate is low as every citizen can get a job. Furthermore, the developed countries have a great number of career-oriented women. Number 5, developed countries generate more revenue from industrial sector, and the level of exports is higher than the level of imports. Number 6, they have high standard of living, excellent communication and educational facilities, high child welfare, and medical facilities. Moving on to the developing countries. Number 1, they have low standard of living, low GDP, unequal distribution of income, and hence low HDI. Number 2, the mortality rate in developing countries is greater than the mortality rate in developed countries. Malnutrition to both mother and infants, which then results in a low life expectancy. Number 3, unlike in developed countries, security in developing countries is still very minimal and inappropriate. Therefore, crime rates in developed countries are still relatively high. Number 4, annual income in developing countries is not as high as in developed countries due to the high unemployment rate. Number 5, due to the low management of natural resources and human resources in developing countries more often buy goods from abroad. Number 6, the developing countries have less educational, transportation, communication, and medical facilities. There is unsustainable government debt and high level of poverty. Take an example of Australia. It is a developed country with the GDP 2019 $1,396.57 billion. Population 2019 25.36 million. GDP per capita 2019 55,057.2. HDI 2020 0.944. Australia has a high-income economy, which is world's 12th largest economy, 10th highest per capita income, and 8th highest human development index. It is regarded as a developed country because of its standard of living. It is a regional power and has the world's 13th highest military expenditure. Australia is one of the wealthiest countries in Asia-Pacific region with a 20-year economic expansion. It has a high average life expectancy of about 85 years. As of 2019, the infant mortality rate of the country is 3 deaths per 1,000 lives. The inhabitants have the better quality of life, as they rate their happiness as 7.3 out of 10, which is higher than the global average of 6.4. Similarly, Germany is the developed country with the GDP 2019 $3,861.12 billion, population 2019 83.09 million, GDP per capita 2019 46,467.5, HDI 2020 0.947. Germany is Europe's strongest economy and the world's 4th largest economy. The country is well known for producing high-quality items like machinery, automobiles, electronics, as well as pharmaceuticals. In 2019, Germany had the world's largest and surplus economy in terms of imports and exports. It is the 4th largest shareholder of World Bank. It has a high GDP per capita as well as a high HDI. The country has an 81-year-old life expectancy as of 2019, with an infant mortality rate of only 3 deaths per 1,000 live births. Citizens of Germany have access to universal health care. Every German is required to join a not-for-profit medical fund that covers the cost of majority of the operations and prescriptions. Now, if we look at Kenya, which is a developing country, it has GDP 2019 $98.84 billion, population 2020 53.77 million, GDP per capita 2020 $1,838.21, HDI 2020 0.601. Kenya is a country in Eastern Africa bordering the Indian Ocean. It is a developing country because it has less developed industrial base and a generally lower human development index. Its GDP when compared to other nations is lower too. As of 2016, 36.1% of its population lives below the international poverty line. Moreover, its key development challenges still include poverty, inequality, transparency and accountability, climate change, continued weak private sector investment, and the vulnerability of the economy to internal and external shocks. Now, you might be thinking that, why isn't China considered a developed country yet? Let's find out. China has GDP 2019, $14.7 trillion. Population 2019, 1.4 billion. GDP per capita 2019, 10,216. HDI 2020, 0.761. Even though China seems to appear as developed, it is still classified as a developing country. This is due to the fact that the rates of poverty and unemployment are high in this region. Moreover, its GDP per capita is too low as compared to that of the developed countries. Similarly, China has an HDI of 0.76, which is less than the HDIs of a developed country, indicating that it is not one of the world's most evolved nation. Another factor that is often mentioned as a reason that China should still be considered a developing country is the fact that development in the country is incredibly uneven. For instance, much of China's economic growth is concentrated in the country's coastal areas. The interior provinces have seen much less growth and development, not to mention the fact that there is a very wide wealth gap between those who live in China's cities and those who continue to live in rural areas. Have a look at the comparison chart representing the differences between developed and developing countries for a better understanding. I hope we have cleared the concept of differences between developed and developing countries. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask us. We will be happy to answer them for you. If you found this video informative and enjoyed the content, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button as well. Thank you for watching.
A rough situation, you know. When I'm behind bars and no family member not even remembering, no one not even visit. So me I say, tears running down my face with food and clothes in our hands at the prison gate. Yeah, another visit I must pray to a friend who's confined by the law and the state. And I pray for divine intervention. And I pray he'll receive salvation. And I pray for his good transformation. And I pray, I pray, I pray. I pray for my sister in captivity. I pray she hear your voice with clarity. I pray for her protection and security. And I pray, I pray, I pray. Can't imagine how scared you are. For years been restricted by walls and prison bars. Yeah, being told when to sleep, when to wake up a bath, or when to eat. And I pray for divine intervention. And I pray he'll receive salvation. And I pray for his good transformation. And I pray, I pray, I pray. I pray for my sister in captivity. I pray she'll hear your voice with clarity. I pray for her protection and security. And I pray, I pray, I pray. Sin have you bound and trapped, not free. Only through Christ can you have this liberty. Even before you serve your time, just remember when he was on the cross, he had you on his mind. And I pray for divine intervention. And I pray he'll receive salvation. And I pray for his good transformation. And I pray, I pray, I pray. I pray for my sister in captivity. I pray she'll hear your voice with clarity. I pray for her protection and security. And I pray, I pray, I pray. Hey, tears running down my face with food and clothes in my hands at the prison gate. Yeah, another visit I must pay to a friend who's confined by the law and the state. And I pray for divine intervention. And I pray he'll receive salvation. And I pray for his good transformation. And I pray, I pray, I pray. I pray for my sister in captivity. I pray she'll hear your voice with clarity. I pray for her protection and security. And I pray, I pray, I pray. Hey, sin have you bound and trapped, not free. Only through Christ can you have this liberty. Even before you serve your time, just remember when he was on the cross, he had you on his mind. And I pray for divine intervention. And I pray till we see salvation. And I pray for this good transformation. And I pray, I pray, I pray. I pray for my sister in captivity. I pray she'll hear your voice with clarity. I pray for her protection and security. And I pray, I pray, I pray. I pray for divine intervention. I pray till we see salvation. And I pray for his good transformation. And I pray, I pray, I pray, I pray. The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. My brothers and sisters, you're only confined to be refined. You're not forgotten.
Hopefully by now we're all savvy enough to stop saying third world countries, but saying developing nations sounds condescending too. We usually end up calling them those nations, which might be even worse. Which nations? Those nations over there. Don't touch them. So what should we call those nations? First off, the term third world is really wrong. It comes from the 1950s, and at the time, the first world meant countries aligned with the West or the United States. The second world was nations aligned with communist Russia. This only sort of made sense then and makes absolutely no sense now. As for the third world, that referred to everything else. It includes those nations we mean when we say third world, but it also included places like Greenland and the United Arab Emirates. It was too general and as such not super useful. So what about the term developing nations? India, China, and Brazil are actively developing and sort of fit into that category, but people tend to call those newly industrialized countries, or they just call them India, China, and Brazil. Developing nations also include places like Syria and Somalia, but they aren't developing at all. In fact, they're spiraling. So the word developing in developing nations doesn't actually mean anything. You could say poor nations, but not if you go off their GDP. Currently, Iraq is 56th on the UN's list, and Iceland is 123rd. When you're talking about poverty, you don't usually mean Iceland. So for the last time, what should you say? Well, it's awkward and long, but you should say countries on the UN's list of least developed nations, which is a mouthful, but it's accurate. These 48 countries on the official and somewhat regularly updated list are those nations. Granted, it doesn't include all the nations people mean when they throw around those other terms, but when you're talking about world poverty, this is the place to start.
America is often perceived as a first world country, and while it certainly is in many ways, there are also areas where it falls behind third world countries. In this video, we take a look at some of how American cities are worse than third countries. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. Crime is out of control. In many American cities, crime is out of control. Some areas are so dangerous, even the police won't go into them. This is something you would expect to see in a third world country, not the United States. Crime has gotten so bad that many people have stopped going out at night and even leaving their homes during the day. And it's not just petty crimes like picking pockets. It's murder, rape, and assault at the highest rates ever recorded. The infrastructure is crumbling. In many American cities, the infrastructure is crumbling. Roads are full of potholes, buildings are falling apart, and there is garbage everywhere. There is no street lighting, and there are frequent power outages. Trash piles up on the side of the road, and there is no trash collection or recycling service available to residents. Even when you live in a nice neighborhood with a good school district and safe streets, you'll find yourself dealing with all kinds of problems just trying to get from one place to another on foot or by vehicle. In recent years, the development of Chinese cities has surpassed that of US cities. This is because the Chinese government has been investing heavily in infrastructure, while many American cities have been neglected. The schools are failing. Schools are failing in America. Test scores are low, violence is high, and dropout rates are skyrocketing. When compared to schools in other countries such as China and India, American schools are far behind. Many students can't even read or do basic math when they graduate. Education is a key indicator of future success within a country, and this shows that America is falling behind. There is no sense of community. Community is essential for human beings, and in many American cities, it is non-existent. People are isolated in their homes and apartments, and they don't interact with their neighbors. The people in third world countries have a greater sense of community because they have to rely on each other for survival. In America, people live for themselves, not for their neighbors. People are more concerned with their own well-being than the well-being of their communities. The economy is struggling. In many American cities, the economy is struggling. There are high rates of poverty and unemployment, and businesses are leaving in droves. While many cities in the United States are dealing with economic problems and struggling to find solutions, some cities are handling the challenges better than others. Some cities have been able to turn their economic woes around by finding new ways to make money and attract business. Other cities have simply given up on trying to fix their broken economies and have instead focused on making the best of what they have available to them. Public transportation is a joke. Public transportation is a joke in many American cities. The buses are infrequent and unreliable, and the trains never seem to go where you need them to go. If you want to get around in most American cities, you're better off just driving your own car. This is one area where third world countries often have an advantage over the United States. With the vast network of transportation options, it's easy to get around in most Chinese cities. You can take the bus, the subway, a taxi, or even a bicycle. In the United States, however, public transportation is often lacking, making it difficult to get from one place to another. When it comes to the walkability of European cities, for example, you have cycle tracks and other pedestrian-friendly infrastructure, while in the United States, many cities don't have these amenities, making them difficult to navigate for those who don't have a car. This car dependency can be frustrating and even dangerous, as pedestrians are often forced to walk in the street alongside traffic. They have higher rates of air pollution. American cities are worse than third world cities because they have higher rates of air pollution. Air pollution is a major problem in many American cities, including Los Angeles, New York City, and Chicago. The air quality in these cities is so bad that it can lead to asthma attacks and even lung cancer. In third world countries, most people do not have cars or live in homes that are heated with natural gas or coal, two things that release large amounts of carbon dioxide into the air. This means that air pollution is less prevalent in those areas than it is here in the United States. Cities in third world countries have natural air filtration systems, such as trees and plants, that help to clean the air. American cities often lack these natural filters, resulting in higher levels of air pollution. They have more people living in poverty. When you think of a third world country, you may be picturing a place where everyone is covered in dirt, living in tents, and picking through trash to eat. But there are also many other ways that American cities compare unfavorably to their third world counterparts. For example, many cities in the United States have homeless populations that are a serious problem. Cities such as Detroit, New Orleans, and Philadelphia all have high rates of poverty and homelessness. And while there is poverty in many third world countries, it's often not as extreme as the poverty one finds in American cities. These are just a few of the reasons why American cities are more like third world cities than anything else. If something doesn't change, they're only going to get worse. Empires have fallen throughout history, and these great nations have been forgotten. It's not impossible to imagine that the same thing could happen to America. Cities are falling apart, and unless something changes, America may soon be nothing more than a memory.
If I say the words third world country, what image comes to mind? Most likely something out of a World Vision commercial. Starving children, ramshackle villages, corrugated metal huts, dirty water, disease, corruption, human rights abuses, and war. Now, what about a first world country? Well, if you're watching this video right now, odds are you live in one of those, wealthy, industrially developed, and democratic. And finally, what do you think of when I say second world country? If you've just drawn an enormous blank, you're not alone. While the terms first world and third world are part of our everyday vocabulary, the second world that should logically complete the trio almost never comes up. Nor, for that matter, do the definitions of first world and third world, the terms largely being used as convenient but vague stand-ins for rich countries and poor countries. So, what is the second world anyway? What actually makes a country first world or third world? And who came up with this classification system anyway? Well, let's find out, shall we? While today the terms first world and third world are largely used to rank countries economically, originally these terms had nothing to do with economics and were instead entirely political categories. The term third world first appeared in a 1952 article in L'Observateur magazine by French anthropologist Alfred Sauvé. Sauvé grouped the world's nations according to their political alignment, with the first world comprising the Western capitalist states like the US and her allies in North America and Western Europe. The second world, by contrast, comprised the communist-aligned nations such as the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, China, North Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba. Finally, the third world encompassed all the remaining nations who are unaligned with either East or West, an enormous bloc which included nearly all the nations of Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Oceania. In drawing these distinctions, Sauvé made a direct connection between the Third World and the Third Estate of the French Revolution. That is, the common people who opposed the monarchy or First Estate and the clergy or Second Estate. Just like the Third Estate, Sauvé wrote, the Third World is ignored, exploited, and despised like the Third Estate, and also wants to be something. As many of these non-aligned nations tended to be poorer, often post-colonial states, the term Third World gradually lost its political meaning and instead became a byword for economic underdevelopment and political instability. This became especially true following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, which rendered the term Second World and the very notion of global political alignment along East-West lines largely obsolete. Even during the Cold War itself, the designation of Third World status to nations was arbitrary at best. In the 1980s, economist Peter Barr pointed out that the wide variety of economies and political alignments lumped into the Third World category made the term of dubious utility. Indeed, the only strong commonality he could find between the nations of the so-called Third World was that their governments demanded and received US economic aid. And as historian B.R. Tomlinson pointed out in his 2003 essay, What Was the Third World? Quote, although the phrase was widely used, it was never clear whether it was a clear category of analysis or simply a convenient and rather vague label for an imprecise collection of states in the second half of the 20th century and some of the common problems that they faced, end quote. Due to this complete shift in the meanings of these terms, many of the original three worlds groupings can seem downright bizarre today. For example, during the Cold War, several Western European nations such as Ireland, Finland, Austria, Sweden, and Switzerland remained neutral and did not join NATO, which according to Alfred Sauvé's original definitions would technically have made them part of the Third World. Similarly, several African nations that are currently classified as Third World, such as Western Sahara, South Africa, Namibia, Angola, and Mozambique, were for many years included in the First World because they were either allied with the West or run as colonies of First World nations such as Spain and Portugal. On a side note, Angola and Mozambique actually became part of the Second World in 1975 when they overthrew their colonial governments and embraced communism. Now, while today the Second World is hardly ever mentioned, even more obscure is the category of Fourth World, coined in the 1970s by Chief George Manuel of the indigenous Shaswat people of British Columbia, Canada. According to Manuel, the Fourth World comprises indigenous people and other cultural entities that exist outside of formal nation-state boundaries. So what does this mean for us today? How do we determine what makes a first world or third world nation? Although these terms are still widely used in everyday discussion, many economists and global development experts argue that they are outdated, derogatory, and reinforce negative stereotypes. Today, the preferred term used by the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and World Health Organization is developing country. The WHO and United Nations further divide this category into developing and least developed, while other analysts use the categories low income and lower middle income, or LMIC countries. Another popular term that has emerged in recent years is the Global South, referring to the fact that a large proportion of the world's poorest nations lie south of the equator. However, this term is not 100% accurate, for several poor nations like Haiti lie north of the equator, while several wealthy developed nations like Australia and New Zealand lie south of it. But while such terms are intended to be less politically charged and judgmental than the old three worlds categories, some experts still see them as problematic. As social psychologist Shoes Kessie of the University of Cape Town in South Africa argues, I dislike the term developing world because it assumes a hierarchy between countries. It paints a picture of Western societies as ideal, but there are many social problems in these societies as well. It also perpetuates stereotypes about people who come from the so-called developing world as backward, lazy, ignorant, irresponsible. In my view, the developing relationship in many ways replaces the colonizer-colonized relationship. The idea of development is a way for rich countries to control and exploit the poor. You can see this through the development industry, where billions of dollars are spent but very little gets achieved. Come to think of it, actually, I hate the term. In response to such criticism, some experts have come up with yet another alternative, the majority world, a term which acknowledges that the vast majority of the world's population lives in so-called developing countries, with 80% surviving on less than $10 per day. Yet, in spite of such debates over terminology, the general consensus among global development agencies is that developing or third world countries are those which suffer from the following: high poverty and income inequality, high child mortality, low economic and educational development, and low consumption of their own natural resources, making them vulnerable to exploitation by large corporations in developed nations. The Education Index, along with life expectancy and gross national income, or GNI per capita, are used by the World Trade Organization and United Nations to calculate the Human Development Index, or HDI, which is measured on a scale of 0 to 1. According to this measure, the fifth least developed countries on Earth are Mozambique with a score of 0.456, Burkina Faso and Sierra Leone at 0.452, Mali at 0.434, and Burundi at 0.433. Looking at gross national income per capita alone, the 5 poorest countries in the world are Malawi at $995 per person, the Democratic Republic of Congo at $978 per person, Central African Republic at $972, South Sudan at $884, and Burundi again at $783. Another measure of a nation's development is its record of human and political rights and civil liberties. According to the Freedom House Freedom in the World Index, the 5 least politically free countries on a scale of 0 to 100 are Eritrea and Turkmenistan at 2, Tibet at 1, Syria at 0, and South Sudan at -2. Finally, according to Reporters Without Borders, the 5 worst countries with regards to freedom of the press are, with 0 being completely free and 100 being completely hostile, Saudi Arabia at 66.37, Egypt at 68.88, Eritrea at 72.36, China at 80.43, and Syria at 82.05. What these numbers reveal is that, surprise, surprise, the world is a complicated place and difficult to sort into categories as neat and tidy as first, second, and third world. For example, while supposedly first world countries like China are economically developed, they score low in terms of human rights and freedom of the press. And while many supposedly third world countries are indeed economically underdeveloped, in many cases community ties and traditional social safety nets are far more developed than in first world countries. In conclusion, nations are made up of people, and if there's one thing certain about people, it's that they refuse to play by the rules.
Together now. Take a look inside the world. Mankind have no love at all. Why do we fight against our own? Now misery won't leave us alone. If only we could unite, there would be no reason to fuss and fight. Let's get it together, you and I. Let us try. Let's get it together, you and I. Let us try. No matter how you treat man, man will never be satisfied. They rob and cheat, run another, falsely testify. When will you see it's I and I who fight the struggle every day? We do our best, receive less. Many don't get no pay. We're all in the struggle together. Say that we're all in the struggle together. Say that we're all in the struggle together. Say that we're all in the struggle together. Hey. No more divide and segregating. No
Make sure when you fight, you're fighting for the right thing. Oh, what a joy unification brings. I never hurt your heart, and you never hurt my feelings. Let's be hopeful and bright in all our dealings. Oh yeah, that's what I'm believing. Tell you what, we're all in the struggle together. Say we're all in the struggle together. Aye. Oh, we're all in the struggle together. Remember, we're all in the struggle together. Day will come that many will have to answer. Which side of the fence are you on? Are you for the struggle or the opposition? Are you defending right from wrong? Know that we're all in the struggle together. Say that we're all in the struggle together. Tell you what, we're all in the struggle together. Say that we're all in the struggle together. I say, take a look inside the world. They have got no love at all. Why do we fight against our own? Now misery won't leave us alone. If only we could unite, there would be no reason to fuss and fight. Get it together, you and I, let us try. Get it together, you and I, let us try. No matter how you treat man, he'll never be satisfied. No matter how you treat man, he'll never be satisfied. No matter how you treat man, he'll never be satisfied. Oh, I say once more, we're all in the struggle together.
Decades of widening inequality and political corruption have brought America to a breaking point. But just how far have we fallen? In some regards, America has more in common today with the developing world than industrialized nations. Many people are asking, is America becoming a third world country? Now, while that term may be antiquated, it's a question worth answering. When economist Peter Temin of MIT applied a model to measure how various societies are doing, the results were staggering. Temin found that America resembles a developing country in 6 ways. Number 1, political power is concentrated in the hands of the wealthy and corporations. They use their influence to set the rules of the economy for their own gain, giving ordinary citizens almost no say. America resembles a banana republic. Number 2, another way the United States resembles a developing country is the wealthy and corporations keep wages low by gutting protections for workers, busting up unions, and blocking increases in the minimum wage. The typical American worker now earns around $22.65 per hour, not much more than what the typical worker earned 50 years ago, adjusted for inflation. Number 3, meanwhile, as in the developing world, those in power stoke racial, ethnic, and religious tensions in order to prevent a coalition of the working class and poor from rising up against them. Consider Donald Trump's attempts to scapegoat immigrants and play into the hands of white nationalists.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, they're taking your jobs, and you better be careful. Everything's coming across the border. It's like vomit.
Number 4, developing countries have few human rights protections. Here in America, mass incarceration strips millions of people of their rights, often for non-violent offenses. The United States imprisons more people than Russia or even China. Number 5, it's often the case in the developing world that wealthy elites and corporations pay little or nothing in taxes and disregard regulations. For decades, America's wealthy and their enablers in government have lobbied for lower taxes and fewer regulations. America's rich are now paying a far lower share of their incomes in taxes than at any time since World War II. Number 6, and finally, developing nations have a low level of social mobility. Children born poor in America have less of a shot at economic success than children born poor in Canada, Denmark, or the United Kingdom. In order to reverse these trends, we have our work cut out for us. But we can't lose faith in America. Those of us who love this country must demand political and economic reforms to strengthen our democracy and create an economy that works for all. For starters, we must get big money out of politics and stop corporations from bending the rules of the economy in their own favor. We've got to also make the wealthy pay their fair share of taxes in order to ensure the gains of the economy are shared more widely and ordinary Americans can get ahead. We can and must make America work for all. What do you think? How can we save our democracy and economy? Let us know in the comments. If you found this video informative, please also watch our video on the real American story. As always, thank you for watching, and please subscribe to this channel for more videos like this one.
We are the world.
There comes a time when we hiss and call, when the world must come together as one. There are people dying, and it's time to lend a hand to life, the greatest gift of all. We can go on pretending day by day that someone somehow will soon make a change. We are all a part of God's great big family, and the truth, you know, love is
Well, this is not warm tea. This is not iced tea. This is not cocoa tea. This is not Solange tea or chocolate tea. This is not rebel tea. This is not government tea. This is white tea with reality.
We are the world.
There comes a time when we hiss and call, when the world must come together as one. There are people dying, and it's time to lend a hand to life, the greatest gift of all. We can go on pretending day by day that someone somehow will soon make a change. We are all a part of God's great big family, and the truth, you know, love is all we need. We are the world. We are the children. We are the ones who make a brighter day, so let's start giving. There's a choice we're making. We're saving our own lives. It should make a better day, just you and me.
will not be in vain. We can't let them suffer. No, we cannot turn away.
Right now, they need a helping hand.
We are the world. We are the ones who make a better day, so let's start giving. There's a choice we're making. We're saving our own lives. It's you who make a better day, just you and me.
And I just want to say thank you all for being here.
When you're down now and there seems no hope at all, but if you just believe,
There's no way we can fall.
let us
Realize
oh, that a change can only go
when we
stand against us one.
We are the world. We are the children. We are the ones who make a brighter day, so let's start giving.
there's a choice we're making. We're saving our own life. It's true, we'll make a brighter day with you and me. We are the world. We are the children.
We are the ones who make a brighter day, so let's start giving. There's a choice we're making. We're saving our own lives.
It's true, we'll make a brighter day.
We all need somebody that we can lean on. When you wake up, look around and see that your dream's gone. When the earthquakes will help you make it through the storm. When the floor breaks, a magic carpet to stand on. We are the world united by love so strong. When the radio isn't on, you can hear the songs. A guiding light on the dark road you're walking on. A signpost to find the dreams you thought was gone. Someone to help you with the obstacles you stumbled on. Someone to help you rebuild after the rubble's gone. We are the world connected by a common bond. Love, the whole planet singing along. Nosotros somos el mundo. We are the children.
And once again, I just want to thank each and every one of you for being here. It's been a pleasure having your presence, and your time has not been in vain. Greatly appreciated. RR Vlogs, Jim Bob, Patrick Watson, Momo.
We make a better day, just you and me.
Thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to have your presence. And to each and every one of you who are in the mystery room, I want to say thank you. To those of you who come in and catch the replay, once again, I want to say thank you. And to those of you who are here for the very first time, I also want to say thank you. Thank you all for being here as we go into the closing prayer.
Heavenly Father, loving God, as we prepare to conclude, we once again lift up our hearts to you. Our hearts praise you for your utmost wisdom in granting us solutions to the problems offered today. The divine source of all life, we thank you for the gifts of fellowship and understanding, of mutual respect and shared vision. We are grateful for the gifts of perseverance and insight into the common concerns we share. For this and all other graces, we are thankful. As we proceed to our task, may your grace be with us as we fulfill our duties and responsibilities. As you have blessed our coming together, now please do bless our journeys. Lord, you taught us to love, to be humble, and to see you in others. May we perceive your face in each of us and the people around us. May we serve you through them and love them as you have loved. All this we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.